Hello, and thank you for joining us here on Channel 8 for a conversation on charter schools. My name is Matthew Cummings, and I am the Communications Director for Erie's Public Schools. And I'm joined today by three gentlemen to talk about the charter school issue here in the city of Erie and share some insight on the charter school law and some of the challenges faced by school districts in urban areas related to charter schools. So I'd like to introduce our guest today. First of all, Attorney Tim Sinnott of Knox McLaughlin, Gornall and Sinnott. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Matt.
Also, Mr. Richard D'Andrea, our business administrator here in the school district. And Dr. Jay Badams, Superintendent of Schools. Dr. Badams, we'll start with you today. Let's start with the basics of the charter school law and its intent, its original intent. Tell our viewers about the charter school law, how long it's been around, and what the original intent of the law is.
Sure. The charter school law began really around late 90s and it was passed as a way to provide a vehicle for innovation in public education. So charter schools they are actually public schools that are granted a certain amount of leeway from regulation. For example, they're allowed to have up to 25% of their staff uncertified.
Okay.
And they are funded, though, from the same basic education subsidy that provides the lion's share of the funding for Erie's public schools. Again, they were originally thought to be a way for people who wanted to start a school to try innovative approaches to education that could then be replicated by the district itself. And so that was, I think, the original intent.
So you mentioned educational labs from which public schools can learn, and that's part of the intent of the law. Are we seeing that type of innovation across the state and here locally?
You know, I'm sure there are some successful models that have come about as a result of the charter law. There are certainly some national models that have received a lot of attention and that are achieving some pretty impressive results. But overall, we're not seeing necessarily innovative new approaches to education. Rather, what we're seeing are things like strict uniform codes. We're seeing contracts with parents that require them to engage with the school at certain levels. But locally, what we're seeing are some really less than innovative approaches to education, but maybe some more exclusive approaches. We're seeing, for example, approaches that are really decades old with regard to curriculum. And we are seeing smaller class sizes that are being guaranteed by some of the charter providers. But we haven't yet seen anything truly innovative that could be brought to scale in our schools.
Attorney Sinnott, let's dig deeper into the charter school law and the essential components of that law and what charter organizers have to consider when they're planning and thinking about submitting an application.
Okay. Under the charter school law, there are 26 different items of criteria that they have to produce. It includes some basic information like the name of the applicant, the name of the school, the grade levels, the board of trustees. They have to have a board. They have to have some bylaws or criteria for government. They have to have an admissions policy, discipline policy. That discipline policy must comply with the school code. They have to have a financial plan and a physical location. I mean, those are the basics. I mean, and almost every school has to have that. But more important, what they need to have is that they have to have a curriculum and a method of testing students to ensure that they're meeting that curriculum and they're learning from that curriculum. They must have a mission and an educational goal. They must show that they are improving pupil learning. And they have to show that they're doing something different and innovative, as Dr. Badams suggested and indicated. They have to show that they are increasing the opportunity for students to learn in today's society. They must show that it's an expanded choice, something that is different from what's out there today, something that's not being taught in the school district of the city of Erie now. They must basically try to be a model, something that other school districts and other public schools could follow and learn from. And they must obviously be educationally sound. Some other things they have to show are in regard to teaching. They have to be different and innovative in regard to the method of teaching. They have to show that the teachers will be responsible for the school itself. They have to be involved in the educational process. They have to be involved in developing the curriculum. They have to be involved in the overall school as a whole, not only the everyday education, but the formation of the school. How are the teachers involved in the formation of the school? And they also have to show that the community is behind the school itself. They have to show that teachers are behind it, parents, students, community members, and that those individuals are also involved in planning the school itself. So it really must be a school that the entire community is behind, they've been involved in it, not like some of the programs that we've seen lately, where we have a hired expert come in and plan a school that he plans in Philadelphia and tries to bring it here and sell it to this community. That's not the way it was supposed to be. So if they show all those things, then it's a proper charter school. If they don't show those things, then they should be rejected.
So it sounds like the bar is set very high for a potential charter organizer to come before the board, and they actually do come before the Erie School Board first in that process. And the reason behind that is obviously the funding comes from local taxpayers and comes from the local school district. Mr. DeAndrea, if you could talk a little bit about the financing behind charter schools, how are they funded?
Charter schools are funded directly through school districts, every public school district budget. There's a formula-driven calculation that every school district has to complete at the beginning of each year, and it's the cost in that formula are specifically based from the local school district's annual financial report cost, and it also includes the school district's total ADMs, which are average daily membership. So it includes all of the public schools enrollment, enrollment by student. And we develop from that formula a regular education tuition rate and a special education tuition rate. And based upon that formula, it drives out a number, and that number is what we spend, what we pay to each charter school that is approved, irregardless of what the individual charter school's costs are to run their school. They get X number of dollars based upon the school district's budget and enrollment.
So that rate can vary from school district to school district. So
Yes.
in some areas, and in some areas where you might see more advertising for a charter school, that may actually bring in more dollars per child based on that state set formula. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct, yeah.
So in total, what does this mean for local taxpayers? How much are we talking about?
Well, in terms of cost, it's somewhere between $16 and $17 million for Erie School District
Per year?
per year.
Okay.
And that is for 4 brick and mortar charter schools and 7 cyber charter schools. And what that means to taxpayers is, from my perspective, is that it essentially means that public schools are accountable to, obviously, our parents, our students, and our taxpayers. Everything we do, we're accountable to our residents and our taxpayers. If our budget requires an increase, we have to go to the taxpayers for a millage increase. Unfortunately, charter schools, in my opinion, are not accountable to that same taxpayer body.
Right.
Because their funding doesn't come directly from the taxpayer. It's if public school districts require a tax increase for the charter schools, we're the ones that have to impose a tax increase, not the charter schools.
So just so the public understands, you mentioned there are 4 brick and mortar charter schools in this area, 7 cyber schools across Pennsylvania. We have our 18 schools. So essentially, when a taxpayer pays their tax bill, that's funding 29 schools, students
correct,
attending
yeah.
29 schools. And oftentimes I think people just think that it's the public schools in their neighborhood. So that's an important point to make.
That's correct.
What does that equal out to be per student?
For the 13-14 fiscal year, which is the one we're in right now, the regular ed tuition rate is, I believe it's $8,500 per student.
Okay.
And the special education tuition rate is close to $16,000 per student.
So if a charter school can figure out a way to educate that student for $5,000,
Right.
then there's seems to be a margin built in there.
Yeah, I don't know of any charter school that currently, right now, is running a budget deficit or
Right.
has issues with their budget.
Clearly from the formula, that's
Right.
yeah.
I would say all of them, and I don't know that as factual, but I
Sure.
would say 99.9% of them are all carrying probably healthy fund balances,
Right.
well over and above what it takes to run the school.
Right. Attorney Senate, if local and statewide charter schools are accessing this public money and taking it from the public schools, are they held to the same level of accountability as the traditional public schools as we know it in terms of special education or teacher requirements or things like that?
No, they're not. You know, Pennsylvania public schools I brought the school code book here today as a prop or to show you.
The table is leaning in that direction.
Right.
Yeah.
Every public school district has to comply with every law that's set forth in this book. And this is only volume 1. There's a whole nother volume about the same size. And so public school districts have to comply with that. Charter schools don't have to comply with all those requirements. They're in the charter school law. They limit the number of laws that you have to comply with. And one of the things that they don't have to comply with are teacher standards. And what I mean by that, as you've indicated, Dr. Badams has indicated, only 75% of their teaching staff are required to hold an appropriate state certificate from the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. So that means 25% of their staff don't have to be certified. 25% don't even have to be highly qualified. The charter schools have the ability to set their own standards in regard to what they consider to be certified or qualified for that 25%. So you could have your child or your student taught by a teacher that is not certified by the state of Pennsylvania, not highly qualified, but just teaching based on a standard created by the charter school itself.
Now, how does that percentage compare to what's required in a public school?
Public school, 100% certified.
Okay.
So,
there's
and even our educational assistants have to be highly qualified. So totally different standards and basically unfair to public schools, holding them to bigger, better regulations than charter schools are to follow.
Dr. Badams, Mr. D'Andrea talked a little bit about the formula for calculating tuition rates for students. It appears, based on that conversation, that there's a margin in there where charter schools could really be a significant revenue generator for organizations, nonprofits to access these public tax dollars with less accountability.
Sure. There are a lot of things that are excluded when that formula is calculated, when that per pupil number is generated for districts. There are some things that are excluded from that. There are other things that, for example, are contributions to the pension program that are actually duplicated. Okay. So our taxpayers are actually hit with essentially a double dip to the pension fund. That's one discrepancy. The other thing that creates a margin is the fact that public schools in general, certainly in the Commonwealth, are subject to collective bargaining law. And so we have our teacher unions that we negotiate with, and we have our non-instructional associations and so forth. And while charter schools are able to organize, their staff is able to organize, they are not members of the local unions. And so there's definitely a margin with regard to the salaries that the charter schools pay to their teaching staff in particular. And so that enables them to have some additional capital. Now, they do have lease payments, for example, and rents and so forth. They pay for their facilities, I'm sure. But there is that ability to carve out a margin. In some cases, we have administrators that are working at some of our local charter schools. Even though the school may serve 200, 250 students, they'll have a principal and then maybe a CEO drawing a pretty substantial salary. We also deal with cyber charter schools. Now that's an entirely different situation. Here you have an online learning venue without any of the overhead that a brick and mortar school has to operate, and yet they are funded with that same per pupil calculation. So when you drive around town and you see a big video billboard advertising a cyber school, that advertising is being paid for with our taxpayers' money. Mm-hmm. It's coming directly out of our state subsidy and being spent on these Jumbotron ads, the numerous ads that you see, whether it's online, web-based advertising, TV advertising. I think it's a little bit ironic that when you tune into one of our local television channels and you see the cancellations when there's a weather event, mm-hmm. you'll see Pennsylvania Cyber Charter School, their logo is posted right there on the scroll at the bottom that shows the school closings. Well, those are your tax dollars paying for that advertising. Right. And so is there a margin? Obviously there is. There's a pretty substantial one.
Let's stay on that margin just for a second and really talk about cyber charter schools. There was some recent news about one cyber school in Pennsylvania in terms of some federal indictments, and also some news out of Virginia for a school that some of our students attend about CEO compensation. Can you shed some light on those two situations for us?
Sure. There are charter management organizations, and these are probably more prevalent in the eastern part of the state, where you have a company, for example, it's called K-12, provides a lot of online curriculum. This is a private enterprise, mm-hmm. providing the content for students who are participating in a variety of Pennsylvania cyber schools. Their CEO is drawing well in excess of $5 million a year to head that company. And as far as other cybers go, former Auditor General Jack Wagner issued a report as recently as June of 2012, based on research he had been conducting since 2010, that showed that the cyber schools, because they are not charging or they are not billing districts for their actual cost to educate students, on average they have about a $3,000 margin for every single student that they educate. So when you think back again to Pennsylvania Cyber Charter, whose founder and CEO was the subject of that indictment, they're making enough additional money not only to advertise throughout the Commonwealth, but enough extra money that he was able to move money illegally, mm-hmm. or at least allegedly illegally, to buy condos on the beach in Florida, to the indictment cites a lot of other things too, everything from buying airplanes to purchasing his girlfriend's home. I mean, when you think about that much extra money in the system, right? It's really ripe for abuse. And I believe that's a policy issue that really needs to be addressed by our legislators.
And these are millions and millions of taxpayer dollars that are flooded into this system. I mean, Mr. D'Andrea said $16 to $17 million for our school district alone, mm-hmm. and every school district across Pennsylvania, with probably a few exceptions, has students attending these cyber schools and paying those tuition rates.
You're right. Well, those schools actually have offices. PA Cyber, for example, operates out of Midland, PA. Mm-hmm. Our taxpayers' state tax money that's used to fund our basic education subsidy actually leaves. Even though the students are being educated online in this cyber environment, the money physically goes to Midland, Pennsylvania, mm-hmm. where they've been able to do a lot of pretty expensive building projects. They've actually orchestrated what they call the Midland Miracle to revitalize that old mill town.
So Midland, Pennsylvania, cyber operator there is cashing checks from 500 communities across the Commonwealth, essentially.
At least.
We've talked about finance. Let's talk a little bit about academics and how are charter schools in Pennsylvania performing, and have there been any studies to really compare the academic performance of public schools and these charter schools?
Yeah, that's interesting. There have been a couple of large-scale studies. The one that's most often cited by both proponents of charter schools as well as detractors is a study out of an organization called Credo out of Stanford University. And as nationally, they found that charters perform about the same as traditional schools. Mm. So taken as a whole, there's really no difference. And so if you think about the financial impact of charters, to get no real return on that, any different than what we're already getting from our existing public school system, That alone, I think, is a pretty significant finding for people to think about. But the study actually focused on Pennsylvania because Pennsylvania has so many charters and because the laws are so favorable to the establishment of charter schools. They focused and did a report specifically for our Commonwealth. And what they found there was that charter schools in Pennsylvania significantly underperform traditional public schools.
So if we have charter schools that are underperforming public schools and they're not held to the same standards in terms of teacher quality and special education and other things, or the same level of taxpayer accountability for this money, how are these schools attracting students still?
Well, there are a couple of issues. One is the whole concept of choice and sort of the politicization of public education.
Mm-hmm.
And the other is advertising, to be frank. So when I talk about choice has been thrown out there as this sort of God-given right that anybody should be able to have whatever type of school they want. Choice has been used as a rallying point for politicians. Again, using a very emotional topic, which the choice of one's children's public school or private school is certainly a very important decision-making point for any parent. So they have established this idea that people have this right to choice in their public schools, and they've thrown out there as options things like voucher programs and charter schools, and even though there's no evidence to show that they result in better outcomes, there's now this sense that the way to improve or reform public education is essentially to abandon it. And that's one thing that we're fighting. And it's a debate I think that the public really needs to engage in. So think about it. In Pennsylvania, any group of individuals can get together and fill out a charter school application, apply to their local school district, and be granted a charter to start a school. But on the other side of that equation, taxpayers don't have the corresponding control over that decision. Our voters have elected school board members to represent their interests, to oversee the governance of the school districts. And yet, if a charter applicant is denied by the local school board, they can then appeal to a small charter school appeals board in Harrisburg, who can then circumvent the will of the representatives of the electorate. And I think this is another problem that's a problem of policy that we really need to deal with as citizens of this Commonwealth, is that we can now, in the name of choice, circumvent the elected school board and just allow any interested party to start a school and then access public funds. So that's a big issue.
And not to oversimplify this, but it really sounds like the law and the formula is set up where you're taking money and resources from one group of students and essentially just giving that to another group of students. And that's not really the way to improve public education, especially in urban areas, right?
Well, I sure don't believe so, but I get the intent. I think part of and going back to the original question about the intent of the charter law, there is certainly an element of that law that is set up to try to create a competitive situation where these entities are innovating and at the same time providing parents with an alternative to their local public school. And then, of course, inherent in that very creation of these two different entities, you're creating a competitive environment. The difference, though, is the way this law is currently construed, the public school system, the traditional public school system, is still regulated the same way it always was prior to the law. The charter school has this ability to innovate, this ability to have freedom from regulation, and a funding formula that allows them to have a margin, which then allows them to advertise. So if those of you viewing this can imagine, if we actually were able to, if we went out as a school board and purchased advertising on billboards, if we had fancy graphics on vehicles outside of our sporting events, if we had ads in the newspaper, ads on radio, and ads on television, I would think that our public would be quite concerned with how we're spending their money. But the charter schools are advertising continually in all of those various sources of media, And it doesn't surprise me that many parents, between this notion of choice and this really pretty constant advertising, we are losing students to charter schools.
So it sounds like the law was well intended, but it seems to be causing a little bit more harm to urban areas and urban school systems than good. Are there efforts underway to sort of reform the system, to take a look at charter schools and charter school funding in Pennsylvania? And I'll really throw this question out to the group, whoever wants to talk about that. Is there anything in the state legislature right now, or anything pending that can maybe fix this?
Well, there's a mounting debate nationwide. This is a big issue for, I think, everybody to consider. We really have to look at this as a nationwide issue. It affects everybody, even here in Erie. Charter schools aren't causing a lot of pressure on the schools in the county so much. I know there are some students who are taking advantage of cyber school opportunities out there, but as far as brick and mortar charter schools, it is the urban areas that are seeing the biggest influx. And a lot of that is because urban areas struggle with the impact of poverty, and it's those social and economic issues that create that sense that there must be something else, something better. And so we do, I think, have a disproportionate effect or impact of the legislation. Right now, there is a bill, actually two bills. There's a House bill and a Senate bill that are aimed at charter school funding reform. And in my opinion, the Senate bill that's being considered now, it's called Senate Bill 1085. While there are a few elements of that bill that I think would help to fix some of the problems with the law, if anything, it actually creates a more favorable environment for the promulgation of more charters. And it actually takes more control away from the locally elected school board and allows universities to be the chartering entity. Which really would, in my opinion, would be a really bad situation for us to be in when we have such great partners with our local universities.
In that same bill, Senate Bill 1085, and Dr. Badams mentioned that Jack Wagner criticized the funding formula set forth in the charter school law. And he did that back in 2010. But Senate Bill 1085 doesn't really change the funding formula at all. All it does is create another bureaucracy in regard to funding formula. It creates a charter school funding advisory committee that is supposed to try to reform the charter school law. Well, it's been 4 years since Jack Wagner criticized the funding formula. It's time for the legislature to step up and actually change the funding formula, so we don't have a waste of $3,000 per student going to a student that's not getting that type of education for those $3,000.
Yeah, let's hope that moves forward for everyone's sake, really. Dr. Badams, Attorney Senate, and Mr. DeAndrea, thank you very much for joining us today, and thank you all for watching. Is there anything else you'd like to add or tell our viewers before we wrap things up here?
I think it's important just to remind everybody the fundamentals of charter schools and how they work. Charter schools are, in fact, public schools, funded completely by taxpayer dollars. All of the activities that they engage in, including advertising, are paid for by taxpayers. And it's also important to note that in Erie, roughly 1/3 of our budget comes from local property tax. The rest of it comes from our state tax. So those of our neighbors who live in Fairview and Mill Creek and Harbor Creek and Wattsburg and throughout the county, throughout the Commonwealth, are in fact footing the bill for the charter schools that are really serving primarily the students in the city. And so it is a concern for everyone. And again, the whole notion that people elect a school board, and then we've created a law that allows a way to circumvent the will of that school board and the will of the voters and the taxpayers, I think is something that should make this an issue that everybody gets informed on and thinks deeply about. I believe that the way to reform public education is to focus on the schools we already have and make them better, something that we certainly are committed to here in Erie's Public Schools, rather than trying to find ways around them or ways to circumvent them or simply to divert the funding.
Well, thank you all for joining us. This was very informative, and I hope that you found this to be informative as well. Stay tuned to Channel 8, and also be sure to visit our website at eriesd.org to learn more about what's happening in Erie's public schools. Thank you for watching.